January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest. The snow falls in silence. It is the kind of silence that follows violence, a hush born not from peace but from exhaustion. Along a frozen roadside in Belgium, a column of German soldiers stands motionless, their hands raised above their heads. Their uniforms are crusted with ice and mud. Their faces are hollow, carved out by weeks of fighting in sub-zero cold. They are prisoners now. The war for them has ended. One young Gefreiter, no older than 22, watches as American trucks roll past, one after another, after another, after another. They do not stop. They do not slow. They carry ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, replacement troops. The convoy seems endless. He had been told by his officers that the Americans were spent, that their supply lines were broken, that the great offensive through the Ardennes would split their armies and force a negotiated peace. But here, in the snow, watching this river of steel and canvas flow eastward without pause, he understands that he had been lied to. Or perhaps more terrifying still, that his officers had believed their own lies. This is not a story of a single battle. It is the story of a realization, a slow, creeping understanding that spread through tens of thousands of German prisoners of war as they were captured, processed, and transported deeper into the American rear. It is the story of men who had been raised to believe in the superiority of German discipline, German engineering, German will, and who came face to face with something they had not been prepared for: the sheer, relentless, incomprehensible scale of American industrial power. The Germany that sent these men to war had built its doctrine on speed and precision. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, relied on rapid mechanized thrusts, concentrated force, and the assumption that wars could be won before the enemy's economy could fully mobilize. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It had nearly worked in the Soviet Union. The German soldier was taught that his training, his discipline, his willingness to endure hardship would carry the day. Logistics were a concern, yes, but secondary. Victory would be swift. Supply lines would not need to stretch far. By 1945, that doctrine lay shattered in the frozen mud of Europe. The soldiers who surrendered in the Ardennes, in the Rhineland, in the Ruhr pocket, had spent months watching their own supply system collapse. Fuel became scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Rations themselves shrank to near starvation levels. Boots wore through. Vehicles broke down and could not be repaired. Replacements did not come. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had been swept from the skies. The railways, bombed relentlessly, could no longer move materiel to the front. The German war machine, so fearsome in 1940, had been reduced to a skeletal force held together by fanaticism and desperation. And then they were captured. The first shock came in the staging areas. German POWs, expecting the grim efficiency of a military prison camp, perhaps something akin to the harsh conditions they themselves had imposed on Soviet prisoners, were instead processed through vast, organized reception centers. There were forms, there were medical checks, there were delousing stations, clean uniforms, and hot meals. The meals, in particular, defied comprehension. An Obergefreiter from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division later recalled in a post-war interview, "We were given white bread, real white bread, and coffee, and tinned meat. I thought it was a trick. I thought they were fattening us up before shooting us. But then the next day the same, and the next, and I realized this was normal for them. This was what they ate every day. White bread, it became a symbol. In Germany, by 1945, bread was grey and gritty, stretched with sawdust and potato flour. A loaf was a treasure. Here, among the Americans, it was ubiquitous. It appeared at every meal. It was wasted even, left on plates, tossed to the ground. The abundance was not propaganda, it was not a special effort to demoralize the prisoners, it was simply the baseline reality of the American war effort. The same was true of everything else. As prisoners were transported westward, first to temporary camps in France, then to more permanent facilities in Britain or across the Atlantic in the United States, they traveled through the arteries of Allied logistics, and those arteries never stopped pumping. German soldiers watched as American convoys moved day and night. They saw depots the size of small cities, stacked with crates and barrels stretching to the horizon. They saw airfields where planes landed and took off in endless rotation, ferrying supplies and personnel without pause. They saw harbors where Liberty ships, those mass-produced cargo vessels, churned out at a rate of 3 per day at the height of production, disgorged mountains of equipment onto French and Belgian docks. One Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured near Aachen in October 1944, wrote in a diary later recovered by Allied intelligence, "I used to believe that our generals were conservative, that they underestimated American production to keep us motivated. Now I see they did not underestimate. They simply could not conceive of it. No one could. This is not war as we understand it. This is something else. This is industry wearing a uniform." The statistics bear out his horror. By 1944, the United States was producing more war materiel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, and doing so while simultaneously raising the standard of living for its civilian population. In 1943 alone, American factories produced over 85,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, and 2.6 million trucks. The German war economy, mobilized for total war since 1942, managed 25,000 aircraft and 12,000 tanks in the same year. The disparity was not marginal, it was existential, and the American system did not merely produce, it delivered. The German military, for all its tactical brilliance, had always struggled with logistics over distance. The invasion of the Soviet Union had faltered not only because of Soviet resistance, but because German supply lines could not keep pace with the advance. Horses, hundreds of thousands of horses, still hauled the majority of German supplies, even in 1944. Mechanization was a luxury reserved for the spearhead units. The rest of the Wehrmacht marched and hauled as armies had for centuries. The Americans, by contrast, had built an entirely mechanized force. Every division had trucks, every corps had dedicated supply battalions. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system established after the breakout from Normandy, moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day along a dedicated highway route driven by predominantly African-American soldiers who worked in grueling round-the-clock shifts. When bridges were destroyed, engineers rebuilt them within hours. When rail lines were cut, trucks took over. When trucks bogged down in mud, transport planes dropped supplies by parachute. The German POWs saw this. They lived inside it. They rode in the trucks, ate the rations, wore the surplus clothing, and they began to understand that they had not merely lost battles, they had been fighting a war that could not be won. One sergeant from the 2nd Panzer Division, interviewed by American intelligence officers in early 1945, said simply, "You cannot defeat a nation that can afford to waste." The waste, indeed, was what struck many of the prisoners most forcefully. In a German unit, every bullet was counted, every liter of fuel was precious. Soldiers were expected to scavenge, to improvise, to make do. American soldiers, by contrast, seemed almost careless. If a jeep broke down, it was often abandoned and a new one requisitioned. If rations were unappetizing, they were discarded. Equipment was replaced, not repaired. This was not carelessness. It was the luxury of abundance. A German panzer crewman, captured after his tank ran out of fuel during the Battle of the Bulge, later recounted watching an American armored column refuel in the field. "They had tanker trucks," he said. "Not one, not two, a dozen. They filled every tank in the battalion in less than an hour. We used to siphon fuel from wrecks, carry it in jerry cans, dilute it with anything flammable we could find, and here they were, pouring it in like water. I knew then that we had lost, not because they were better soldiers, but because they had so much, and we had nothing. The contrast extended beyond materiel. It was cultural, philosophical. The German soldier had been taught self-denial, sacrifice, the supremacy of the collective will. The American soldier, by and large, had not. He grumbled, he questioned orders, he wanted to go home. But he was fed, clothed, equipped, and supported by a system that treated him not as an expendable cog, but as a valued asset. Medical care was a stark example. German POWs wounded before capture were often astonished by the speed and quality of American battlefield medicine. Plasma, sulfur drugs, penicillin, treatments that were rare or non-existent in the Wehrmacht, were standard in the US Army. Medics moved with the front lines. Field hospitals were supplied as thoroughly as combat units. The survival rate for American wounded was the highest of any army in history. German prisoners receiving the same care could not reconcile it with the image of a decadent, individualistic society they had been taught to despise. The ideological dissonance deepened as prisoners were moved further from the front. Those transported to the United States, over 400,000 German POWs were held in camps across America during the war, experienced a nation entirely untouched by the destruction of war. They saw cities with lights blazing at night, factories running at full capacity, civilians living in comfort. They worked on farms, in canneries, in forestry camps, and were paid in scrip that could be spent in camp canteens, stocked with goods that had vanished from German shelves years before. One prisoner held in a camp in Texas wrote to his family after the war, "I thought America was a land of gangsters and corruption, weak and divided. Instead, I found a country more organized, more wealthy, more united than I had ever imagined. We were told we were the master race, but we were living like beggars while they lived like kings." This was the transformation, the slow erosion of certainty. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on the promise of German superiority, on the myth that democratic societies were decadent and weak, that only through authoritarian strength could a nation achieve greatness. The German soldier, indoctrinated from childhood, believed this. And then he was captured, and the myth collapsed under the weight of observable reality. Not all prisoners experienced this transformation immediately. Some clung to their beliefs, insisting that the war could still be won, that secret weapons would turn the tide, that the Americans and Soviets would turn on each other. But as the months passed, as Germany surrendered, as the camps began the long process of repatriation, the evidence became undeniable. The recurring symbol in so many post-war accounts remained that white bread. It was mundane, trivial even, but it represented something larger, a society capable of feeding its soldiers and its prisoners without strain, a system of production and distribution so vast that it could wage a global war and still maintain abundance. It was proof, tangible and daily, that the ideology they had fought for was built on sand. In the end, the logistics never stopped. The trucks kept rolling, the ships kept unloading, the factories kept producing. The American war machine did not pause, did not falter, did not need to scrape and scavenge and sacrifice. It simply was. For the German soldiers who watched, who lived within it, who saw the contrast between what they had been promised and what they had encountered, the lesson was inescapable. Wars are not won by ideology alone. They are not won by willpower or discipline or tactical brilliance, though all of these matter. Wars are won by the capacity to sustain, to supply, to replace losses faster than they accumulate. Wars are won by the unglamorous work of logistics, by the factories and the farms, by the men and women who build and transport and distribute. The German POWs had been taught to believe in the myth of the superior warrior, the triumph of the will, the destiny of the Volk. They had been sent to fight a war that demanded not warriors but resources, and they had collided with a nation that possessed those resources in quantities beyond comprehension. There is a photograph taken in May 1945 of German prisoners being transported through a liberated French town. The trucks are American. The road is American-built. The prisoners sit in rows, staring out at the ruins of Europe. Behind them, visible in the distance, is another convoy, trucks and jeeps and half-tracks moving east toward Germany, toward occupation, toward reconstruction. The logistics, even in victory, do not stop. One wonders what those men were thinking, whether they understood fully the scale of what they had faced, whether they recognized that their defeat had been written not on battlefields, but in factories in Detroit, shipyards in California, wheat fields in Kansas, whether they grasped that the bread they had eaten as prisoners was not mercy, but merely the overflow of a system so productive that it could afford to feed even its enemies. History remembers the generals, the battles, the turning points. But wars are decided long before the first shot is fired. They are decided in the furnaces and assembly lines in the soil, and the supply depots in the capacity of a nation to turn its resources into power and deliver that power to the front without pause. The German soldier, raised to believe in strength through austerity, in victory through sacrifice, learned a different truth in captivity: that abundance is its own kind of weapon, and that a nation which can feed, clothe, and equip its soldiers without end is a nation that cannot be defeated by force of will alone. The trucks rolled on, the bread was always white, and the logistics, relentless and unstoppable, wrote the final chapter of the war long before the guns fell silent.